Morning, everyone. I hope I'm audible. Uh, Today, we'll begin by talking about tribal integration post independence. Beginning with who are the tribals? किनको बोलते हैं tribalism? Those communities which have a unique culture, religion, customs, and language that is distinct from the mainstream. The reason for this uniqueness is that relative isolation from the mainstream society. And this is because they inhabit those areas where mainstream penetration is limited, such as the remote, hilly, desert, or forest areas. Okay? So this is a functional definition of tribes, because uniqueness, relative isolation, and geographic inhabitation. Out of the total population of India, roughly 8% Indians can be categorized as tribals. We find that they are not only isolated from the mainstream society but isolated from each other as well. As a result, there exist several hundreds of tribes. There are more than 750 tribes in total which inhabit different parts of India. Okay? So, who are the tribals? This is the answer. Write down. Tribals are a group of people living in relative isolation, mostly in forests, hills, and desert areas, having a distinct language, culture, religion, language, culture, religion, and identity. Next point. In India, tribals constitute tribals constitute roughly 8% of the population. Tribals constitute roughly 8% of the population. There are more than 750 tribes spread across different parts of India. With the largest concentration being in two areas. कौन से? सेंट्रल इंडिया और दूसरा नॉर्थ ईस्ट इंडिया. Next, we have to see how the relative isolation of the tribals was broken during the colonial period, that is before interaction. Give the next heading. Interaction of outsiders, sorry, interaction of tribals with outsiders in modern India. देखो, historically, in the ancient and medieval period, there was very little interaction between mainstream society, the state, and the tribals. Why? Because mainstream society did not have anything that it wanted from the tribal areas. ठीक है? तो forest की उतनी ज़्यादा demand, forest produce की उतनी ज़्यादा demand. Of course, forests were being cleared back in the ancient and medieval period also, but because the mainstream population itself was so low and the economic activity was not so well developed, that additional resources were required, right? And therefore there was very little interaction historically. It is only with the advent of industrial capitalism that the mainstream society and the state were incentivized to penetrate into the tribal areas in the hilly regions, forests, and deserts and interact with the tribals openly. Why? Industrial capitalism created several demands. Demands such as land for farming, further timber for construction, and markets for consumption. Okay. And when did industrial capitalism begin emerging? From the second half of the 18th century onwards. It reached a critical peak from 1813 onwards. 1813 to 1857 is also known as the period of industrial colonialism in India, right? It is also concurrent with the period that the British Empire started expanding rapidly to cover large swathes of Indian territory, right? So from the early 19th century onwards, with the acceleration of British imperialism. Not only were large portions of tribal areas conquered by the British, but this was also accompanied by the influx of a large number of outsiders into the tribal areas. And who did these outsiders represent? कौन थे ये outsiders? Outsiders included zamindars, money lenders, traders, missionaries, and government functionaries. Government agents, and the army. What was the effect of the influx of outsiders into tribal areas on the tribals themselves? Was their life better off or did it become worse? It became worse. Impact was that all these groups represented exploitative classes and they began to exploit the tribals without exception, except for maybe a few teachers or doctors. Okay? So, impact was loss of political autonomy, complete economic disruption, and exploitation, and forcible integration of the tribals into the mainstream society characterized by a rigid Varna and caste hierarchy and their marginalization in this social structure. So they were given the lowest of the low positions. Forcible social integration and marginalization. Okay. The tribals also suffered from an acute sense of loss of culture. During British rule, a deliberate attempt was made to destroy the distinct culture of the tribals, to destroy their religion, to take away their distinct language, to erode their political customs, which were distinct from the mainstream legal machinery, and to homogenize them, to integrate them into the mainstream society. Why? So that the tribals could be exploited in this way. Their land could be appropriated for farming, the forest could be brought under government ownership for timber, and the tribals themselves could be converted into taxpayers as well as consumers of British products. ठीक है? तो इसलिए इनके कल्चर को डिस्ट्रॉय करना जरूरी था एंड दिस created a great sense of you can say this was an emotional as well as cultural trauma for the tribals. The tribals were deeply attached to their lands, their religion, their customs, etc., were based on the region that they inhabited. And since most of them were wrested away from their lands, there was a deep sense of loss for them. Okay. What was the tribal response to this exploitation? Frequent tribal revolts and uprisings. These uprisings were largely localized and violent in time. Why localized? Because the tribals were generally inhabitants of isolated areas. Therefore, they had little awareness about their class status as an oppressed class. There was no class collaboration with other exploited classes. Okay? Therefore, their uprisings remain localized, centered around local issues. Violent why? Because warfare was the traditional way in which all previous conflicts were resolved. So it was seen as the logical way in order in which by which to challenge the exploitative regime. Right. Further, by this point of time, we are talking about the 19th century. Modern political consciousness had not permeated the tribal consciousness. Right. They were unfamiliar with the modern ideas or modern methods of political agitation and organization. There was lack of national awareness, and the mainstream national movement was yet to reach that stage where it could influence the thinking of the tribals. Okay? So these uprisings remain localized and violent. And since these were localized and violent uprisings, did they have any hope of actually challenging the might of the British Empire? No. They were all violently suppressed. And following this, what happened to the degree of exploitation suffered by the tribals? Did it decline or increase further? It increased further. Did the tribals play a major role in the mainstream national movement? No. Although tribal demands were incorporated, we see that the tribals were never in a position to set the agenda of the national movement. They had no say in which, in when the movement should be launched, what should be the program that should be adopted, and what specific tribal demands should be raised. For example, we find that during the civil disobedience movement in central India and parts of Karnataka, there were forest agitations. Which called for the violation of forest laws, which had given ownership of the forests and their resources to the government. इनको violate करने के लिए some tribal communities participated during the civil disobedience. However, at the same time, there was no corresponding movement to or no corresponding program to liberate the tribals from the exploitative influence of zamindars and moneylenders in Central. no anti that. And this shows that while the tribals had started to become integrated into the mainstream national movement, they were not in a position to strike out against all types of exploitation. Now, with the liberation of India, while British exploitation stopped, the exploitation of zamindars and moneylenders, etc., of other groups, etc., in the tribal areas, that did not disappear. Right? And what was the result of that? The incomplete process of tribal integration into mainstream politics resulted in their political marginalization and preserved the exploitative relationship between the tribals and outsiders. Right? This was a dangerous recipe for social disharmony, separatism, and even the demands of a separate state. Right? The tribals, because of their continuing exploitation, were also vulnerable to being seduced by extremist ideologies, specifically right wing or left wing extremism. Left wing extremism. This was a recipe for socio-political disharmony and left wing extremism. And thus, a sensitive response to the issue of tribal integration was लिखवाने की जरूरत है या हो जाएगा हो जाएगा now next we arrive at Nehru's approach or formula for tribal integration. Right? Now, following independence, the different scholars, the sociologists and the anthropologists, they were divided with regards to the approach regarding tribal integration. Primarily, there were two schools of thought which represented opposite extremes. Right? पहला आइडिया क्या था? There should be complete isolation of the tribals from mainstream society. And second idea was that there should be complete integration of the tribals into mainstream society, thus dissolving their unique identity altogether. पंडित नेहरू ने किसको चूज किया? नीदर. ठीक है. नेहरू rejected both. And it was in this scenario that an English anthropologist, Verrier Elwin, suggested a middle path. Yeah, that the development of tribals is necessary, but it should not be done forcibly by external forces. Rather, it should be done on the basis of their own genius, in accordance with their own wishes. That tribal development must take place in accordance with their own genius. Right? Now, on the surface, this may seem contradictory. एक तरफ बात हो रही है इकोनॉमिक डेवलपमेंट की, दूसरी तरफ बात हो रही है ट्रेडिशनल ट्राइबल वे ऑफ लाइफ. Right? Traditional tribal way of life is intimately connected to nature, the environment, and modern economic development requires the exploitation of those resources. तो superficially देखने पे थोड़ा contradictory लगता है, but with the vision of Nehru, the expertise of Elwin, and the sincerity and sensitivity of the Indian officials who were required to implement the Nehruvian vision, this was pursued. And on the basis of this vision, a 5-point strategy was developed, known as the tribal Panchsheel. This was to become the Nehruvian strategy for tribal development. क्या है ये? पहले बाकी लिख लीजिए, फिर उसके बाद write down. Following independence, comma, anthropologists were divided with regards to the tribal policy. Two positions were put forward. Two positions emerged. A and B. A, to keep them completely isolated. B, to completely integrate them into mainstream society. Pandit Nehru rejected both. And with the help of the British anthropologist Verrier Elwin developed a unique policy framework known as tribal Panchsheel, tribal Panchsheel, which envisaged tribal development, envisaged tribal development on their own terms, means on the terms of the tribals themselves, and not with borrowed ideas, but with their own genius. But with their own genius. So, next point. The five principles of tribal Panchsheel are as follows. Are as follows. A, B, C, D, and B. A, that tribals must develop with their own genius. B, their land must be protected. Land must be protected. C, their language must be protected and promoted. D, tribals must be included in their own administration. Finally, there should be minimal government in tribal areas. There should be minimal government in tribal areas. ठीक है? Next point लिखो. Next main point. Implementation of these principles required a balancing between different objectives, namely national economic development, tribal economic development, national integration, tribal autonomy, national integration, tribal autonomy, national security and political stability and political stability. ठीक है? So these were the different objectives with keeping in mind which the tribal punishing were to be administered, were to be right. कि मान लो अगर ट्राइबल्स को बहुत ज्यादा ऑटोनॉमी दे दिया तो दे मे डेवलप अ फीलिंग ऑफ सेपरेटिज्म, लेकिन अगर ट्राइबल्स को बहुत ज्यादा सप्रेस कर दिया, वहां पे गवर्नमेंट के ऑर्गेनाइज कर दिया, तो देन अगेंस्ट रिलीजियस टेंडेंसी में if tribal areas are kept completely isolated from mainstream society and commerce, both national economy as well as the tribal economy will suffer. Their integration into the mainstream society may be slowed down. लेकिन अगर बहुत ज्यादा आपने इकोनॉमिक पेनिट्रेशन कर दिया, then the same kind of oppressive relationship that existed with that might reveal. So balancing act, which was like walking a tightrope, करके देखा होगा आपने. कर्तव्यबाज होते हैं वो एक ऊंचे तार के ऊपर या साइकिल चलाते हैं या राइट, so they have to perform a constant balance. That is the kind of exercise and enterprise that was required in the private sector. Now, in some areas, it was with a fair degree of success, while in others, it became ठीक है. तो नेक्स्ट हमको देखना है impact of tribal panchil in different areas. दो इम्पोर्टेंट एरिया जहाँ पे ट्राइबल का कॉन्सेंट्रेशन सबसे ज्यादा है, सेंट्रल इंडिया एंड नॉर्थ ईस्ट. फर्स्ट वी आर गोइंग टू टॉक अबाउट नॉर्थ ईस्ट. नॉर्थ ईस्ट. अंडर दैट फर्स्ट केस स्टडी हम देखेंगे एफा एंड अरुणाचल प्रदेश. जो अरुणाचल प्रदेश वाला रीजन है दैट इज पार्ट ऑफ द असम डिवीजन, राइट. In 1948, in accordance with the principles of tribal panchil, these were separated from Assam and constituted into the Northeast Frontier Agency. Okay. Then, with the Northeast areas Reorganization Act of 1971, NEFA was given the status of a union territory. And finally, in 1986, Arunachal Pradesh was given full statehood. Now, the process leading to the creation of Arunachal Pradesh as a full-fledged state was relatively smooth, structured process. And why was that? Because the principles of the tribal panchil were implemented in a balanced. Therefore, there was a very little tendency of separatism, etc., emerging in this. So, in accordance with the principles of tribal Panchsheel, accordance with the principles of tribal Panchsheel, the Northeast Frontier Agency was created in 1948 out of the Assam division. Out of the Assam division. Point. These principles were implemented sincerely and sensitively, bringing better integration. Better integration. Sensitively bringing better integration. Point. In 1971, through the Northeast Areas Reorganization Act, NEPA was made a union territory. Point. Finally, it was given full statehood in 1986. In 1986. Next case study, the creation of other northeastern states. Now, while the principles of tribal Panchsheel were implemented with sincerity and sensitivity in the NEPA region, this was not the case in other parts of Northeast. Right? Now, with the 1951 Assam reorganization of Boundaries Act, an entity known as Greater Assam was created, consisting of the mainstream Brahmaputra Valley region, and the tribal regions such as present day Meghalaya, Manipur, Tripura, Mizoram, and Nagaland, right? Now, in these tribal areas, autonomous hill councils were created to administer them, right? Now, these hill councils had the power to identify which laws of the Assam Legislative Assembly would be implemented in their regions and which ones would not be. Right? Special protections were also given in the constitution for these hill councils. However, the issue became problematic with the policy of Assamization that was adopted by the government of Assam from the late 1950s, 1960s onwards. What did it call for? It called for the compulsory adoption of Assamese language throughout Greater Assam, including in the tribal regions and not only in the Brahmaputra Valley region. ठीक है? इसका रिजल्ट क्या होगा? How would the tribal communities view this policy? As a direct attack on their unique culture and way of life. And thus, naturally, there was a reaction. And often, this reaction became violent. ठीक है? तो पहले इतना लिख लीजिए, फिर उसके बाद करें. Write down. In the other parts of Northeast India, tribal Panchil was not implemented with the same degree of sensitivity, resulting in constant conflict. Resulting in constant conflict. Constant conflict. The Assam Reorganization of Boundaries Act 1951 created an entity known as Greater Assam, consisting of the Brahmaputra Valley, and peripheral tribal areas such as Meghalaya, Tripura, Manipur, Mizoram, and Nagaland. Meghalaya, Tripura, Manipur, Mizoram, and Nagaland. Which point? These tribal areas had their own tribal hill councils. Had their own hill councils. So, however, the tribals were not emotionally or psychologically integrated with the Assamese society. The Assamese society. Thus, thus, when the Assam government declared its policy of Assamization to make Assamese Assamization to make Assamese the state language. The tribal areas formed a grand alliance and their movement often became violent. Often became violent. में अलग अलग रीजन्स को अलग अलग देखा पहले ए हाले मणिपुर एंड in response to the rising violence 1959 में क्या किया गया the Garo, Khasi and Jaintia councils were given greater autonomy. Namely, they were given all powers of statehood except for having a separate governor and a separate high court. Okay? In 1969, Meghalaya was made a sub-state within Assam. Own legislative assembly. Okay? And finally, in 1971, with the Northeast Areas Reorganization Act, 3 new full-fledged states, Meghalaya, Manipur, and Tripura, were created. ठीक है 1959 में क्या हुआ है Garo, Khasi and Jaintia councils have been given greater autonomy with all powers of a state except for having a separate governor, a separate high court and a separate legislative assembly. मेघालय को 1969 में एक सब स्टेट बना दिया गया विद इन द ग्रेटर असम रीजन with its own legislative assembly, and in 1971 to the Nara, Meghalaya, Manipur and Tripura as 3 new states. ये हो गया मेघालय, मणिपुर एंड त्रिपुरा का एक्सपीरियंस. नेक्स्ट वी हैव नागालैंड. यहाँ पे क्या प्रॉब्लम हुआ? That from the very beginning the movement became violent. ठीक है. PZ Piso, prominent Naga tribal leader, declared independence. सरकार को भेजनी पड़ी आर्मी यहाँ पर in order to suppress the movement. In order to suppress the movement, and this made the uprising even more, you can say, difficult to overcome. Finally, a political solution निकला, and a smaller group of moderate Nagas led by Dr. Imkong Iba Ao were persuaded to come to the negotiating table. Right? State ने क्या, center ने क्या बोला? That drop your demand for independence, and in return we are going to give you full statehood. And thus in 1962 Nagaland was given full statehood, making it the 16th state in freedom. In 1955, led by PZ Piso, the Nagas declared independence, and the government had to deploy the army. Leading to a prolonged conflict. Give me 1 second. Huh? Had to send in the army, leading to a prolonged conflict. Next point likho. Ultimately, a moderate group of Nagas led by Dr. Imkong Liba Ao, agreed to drop the demand for separate statehood, for independence, and in accordance with the agreement, Nagaland was made the, the 16th state of India in 1962. Yes. Mizoram, write down. A similar separatist movement emerged among the Mizos, led by Lal Denga, who was the leader of the insurgents, led by Lal Denga. Stop. Once again, the government entered negotiations with the moderates, resulting in Mizoram becoming a union territory in 1971. Becoming a union territory in 1971. So stop. Next point. A union territory in 1971. A union territory in 1971. Next point. However, a splinter group emerged. And the conflict continued. Till 1986. When a new accord was signed. According to this, Mizoram was given full statehood in 1986. ठीक है, तो समझ में आया क्या हुआ है? There's a group of Mizos who are opposing the Assamization policy. They have declared independence. The government sends in the army. Moderates इसमें से invite किए जाते हैं for negotiations, and they agree that Mizoram shall become a separate union territory outside Assam. However, ये जो ज़्यादा extremist leaders हैं, जो ultras हैं, they decide to continue the struggle, and the fighting continues till 1986 when Mizoram is finally given full state. 1971 में UT status and में full state. ठीक है? So this was the process of tribal integration in the northeast areas. दूसरा वाला कौन सा एरिया है? सेंट्रल इंडिया. Now, the situation of tribals in northeast India was very different from the situation of tribals in central India. Tribals in central India are spread over a vast region comprising present-day Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, parts of Maharashtra, West Bengal, Odisha, and even parts of Andhra Pradesh. Right? Now, while the number of tribals present in central India is far larger than the number of tribals in northeast India, difference is in northeast India में mainstream population बहुत कम है. These are sparsely populated. Whereas these central India में these are heavily populated. Therefore, tribals constitute a minority. ठीक है. और democratic system में this was a big disadvantage. Why? Because they would never emerge as an influential group within each of these states, क्योंकि यहाँ पे population का एक minuscule portion है. Further, in central India, tribals also suffered from certain other disabilities, such as illiteracy, poverty, underdevelopment, and low degree of political empowerment. They were also subjected to some other social disabilities. Because यहाँ पे जो process of forcible integration into mainstream society and marginalization था, वो ज़्यादा deeply undertake किया गया. Were subjected to several social disabilities such as restriction from access to education, untouchability, etc., discrimination, right? So these were the other problems that they were facing. So write down. In central India, tribals are spread across a vast region covering Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, West Bengal, Odisha, Maharashtra, and Andhra Pradesh. So, next point. Unlike northeastern states, tribals are a minority in central India with poor socio-economic development. Poor socio-economic development. Development. Next point. Their major issues included illiteracy, poverty, backwardness, underrepresentation in local assemblies, exploitation, under क्या लिखा आपने backwardness, comma, underrepresentation in local assemblies, comma, exploitation of natural resources, comma, displacement due to land acquisition and social disabilities. And social disabilities. Displacement due to land acquisition and social disabilities. ठीक है. Result क्या होगा इसका? Are the tribals going to be satisfied? No, they are going to be dissatisfied, disaffected, leading to several protests and movements. Write down. Next main point. This resulted in widespread unrest and protests. And protests. The tribal movement in central India. Tribal movement in central India took the shape of the Jharkhand. Took the shape of the Jharkhand. अगला हेडिंग दो, झारखंड में. The earliest leader to mobilize the tribals of central India was Jaipal Singh of central India. Mobilize the tribals of central India was Jaipal Singh. ठीक है, फुल स्टॉप. क्या लिखा है आपने? The tribals of central India was Jaipal Singh. Right. Next point. In 1950, he founded the Jharkhand Party, demanding a separate tribal state in South Bihar. Separate tribal state in South Bihar. ठीक है. Next main point. However, the States Reorganization Commission rejected or accepted this demand? Rejected this demand. याद है किस बेसिस पर? States Reorganization Commission had given its approval only to the principle of linguistic reorganization of states. और क्या लॉजिक दिया? झारखंड क्यों नहीं बनना चाहिए? Language in North Bihar and South Bihar is the same, that is Hindi. ठीक है? So write down. The States Reorganization Commission (SRC) rejected this demand on the grounds of linguistic similarity in North and South Bihar. Linguistic similarity in North and South Bihar. Stop. Next point. Gradually, due to continuing exploitation, the movement became radical. And the Jharkhand Mukti Morcha (JMM) emerged in the 1970s. under which charismatic tribal leader? शिबू सोरेन. ठीक है, अंडर शिबू सोरेन. It joined hands with other radical groups such as the MCC, Marxist Communist Center, such as the Marxist Communist Center. And a violent struggle started. A violent struggle started. Next point. The violence continued till the 1980s, when when Shibu Soren entered mainstream politics. Entered mainstream politics. और immediately after the 1980s, 1990s में क्या हुआ? Political scenario of the country changed very sharply. पहले कांग्रेस रूल होता था, अब coalition era, right? And now even small parties, small regional parties had the ability to influence the outcome of national politics. ठीक है, write down. Next point. During the 1990s, the JMM became highly influential due to the onset of the coalition era. The coalition era. In both the center and the states. Both the center and the states. ठीक है, next point. This period also witnessed a strong movement in eastern Madhya Pradesh for a separate tribal state. 1991 में, after the collapse of the VP Singh government, PV Narasimha Rao's minority government had been created. और उसको बाहर से सपोर्ट किसने दिया? JMM, right? Along with him, a number of other scheduled caste and scheduled tribe leaders supported the government and continued to do so throughout the 1990s. They played a very pivotal role not only in the regional politics but also in the national politics. And as their influence increased, the country started moving towards the creation of separate tribal states in Central India as well. Write down. Ultimately, next point. Ultimately, through the MP Reorganization Act 2000 and Bihar Reorganization Act 2000, छत्तीसगढ़ and Jharkhand emerged as the 26th and 28th state respectively. State respectively. ठीक है? States respectively. All right? तो ये हो गया the process of tribal integration in central India. Now, the constitution has also put in place several provisions and safeguards to protect the interests, distinct culture and customs of the tribals, to provide for their economic development in accordance with the principles of tribal punishment. Write down constitutional provisions and safeguards. These include A, B, C, D. A. Schedule 5. What does Schedule 5 of the Constitution provide for? Tribal areas, जहाँ पे autonomous tribal councils create करे थे, right? B. Schedule 6. What does it provide for? Scheduled areas with even greater autonomy for tribal councils in the regions of Assam, Meghalaya, Manipur and Tripura. C. Article 46. क्या है ये? It is a directive principle of state policy which places the responsibility upon the state to extend the Panchayati Raj system to the tribal areas. D. Creation of tribal advisory councils. Tribal advisory councils. Therefore, in states with sizable tribal populations, there must be tribal advisory councils in order to aid and advise the governor apart from the elected council of ministers. ठीक है? तो governor specific policies को implement करेगा with respect to the tribal areas. Next, E. Scheduled Tribes Commission. Constitution provides for the creation of a scheduled tribes commission. Purpose क्या होगा इसका? To look into tribal issues, to look into their problems, and to oversee the implementation of schemes and policies which are designed to improve the quality of life of tribals. Next, F. Reservation in the Lok Sabha. कितना? 7.5%. G. Reservation in state legislative assemblies. How much? In proportion to their population. In proportion to their population. किसी स्टेट में अगर 60% पॉपुलेशन है ट्राइबल्स का तो वहां पे 60% मिलेगा, कहीं पे अगर 6% तो वहां 6% मिलेगा. ठीक है. नेक्स्ट, H, reservation in employment and education. I, special powers to governors of certain states, special powers to governors of certain states with tribal populations, with tribal populations. And J, welfare schemes to provide education, health, employment, welfare schemes to provide education, health, employment, and remove poverty. So, next point, main point. These provisions and safeguards have yielded tangible benefits, have yielded tangible benefits in the form of better tribal integration, benefits in the form of better tribal integration, comma, political stability, comma, better health and education outcomes, and political empowerment. Political empowerment. However, more efforts are needed. More efforts are needed to safeguard tribal interests. To safeguard tribal interests, since they continue to remain some of the most vulnerable sections of the Indian population. Of the Indian population. Some of the most vulnerable sections of the Indian population. Okay. So this was tribal integration. Turn a question. Highlight the issues faced by tribals post independence. So, how far have the efforts to alleviate these problems been successful? सबसे पहले आपको आइडेंटिफाई करने हैं issues or problems faced by tribals पोस्ट इंडिपेंडेंस कैसे करोगे? लिंक पोस्ट इंडिपेंडेंस प्रॉब्लम्स with the pre-independence experience. क्या देखने के लिए मिलेगा? Their political underdevelopment and disempowerment, lack of autonomy and agency. Economic exploitation by outsiders, their social marginalization and their loss of culture. ठीक है, यही प्रॉब्लम्स पहले भी थी, यही प्रॉब्लम्स बाद में भी परसिस्ट हुई. फर्दर some new problems also were added after independence. With the development of modern political consciousness and rising understanding of democracy, tribal demands could be characterized into political, social, economic and cultural. Right? Political demands, greater autonomy and lack of or removal of mainstream influence, which translated into either the demand of political independence or statehood. Socially, they wanted equality. Economically, they wanted self-regulation. And end of exploitation by outsiders. Culturally, they wanted protection of their native cultures. Right? Now, all these demands came together to represent their political demand for either statehood or independence. Okay? Now, further complication emerged in the tribal movement due to the emergence of left-wing extremism and international conspiracy by India's enemies, resulting in not simply a democratic movement for greater autonomy, but a violent move. The Indian response has been a mix of the application of the principles of tribal Panchsheel, counter-insurgency, and economic development in order to weaken the influence of left-wing extremism. Okay? Now, the tribal insurgency emerged in different stages in different parts of India. In Northeast India, it lasted between 1950s right up to the 1980s. And in Central India, it emerged in the 1970s and lasted up to 2000. And result क्या हुआ? Creation of several new tribal states such as Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, Manipur, Tripura, Nagaland, Mizoram, Jharkhand, and Chhattisgarh. Right? So these 7 or 8 states emerged. However, would it be correct to say that all the problems faced by tribals have been done away with? No. Tribals continue to face some problems. किस तरह का? Social and educational backwardness, displacement due to land acquisition, political underrepresentation, and social marginalization that has contributed to a latent feeling of separatism lingering on within certain sections of the tribal population. This has weakened or continued to weaken national integration. And solution क्या होगा इसमें? Implementing the tribal Panchsheel and constitutional safeguards not in letter but in spirit. Right? This strategy has proven to be successful in Arunachal Pradesh and some other areas and can be equally successful if applied with sincerity to all tribals across. Okay? So that is going to be your answer. इस तरह से आप अपने आंसर को कंस्ट्रक्ट कर सकते हो. All the information that we have witnessed in your answer, we have already discussed in your discussion about tribal integration, इस फॉर्म में नहीं डिस्कस किया है. तो यू नीड टू ऑल्सो डेवलप दिस स्किल कि कैसे जितना इंफॉर्मेशन आपके पास फैक्चुअल या फिर एनालिटिकल इंफॉर्मेशन है उसको कैसे अलग अलग पोर्शंस लेने हैं और उसको नए तरह से एक ढांचा बना के उसको मोल्ड करना है आपका. राइट, दैट इज गोइंग टू कम विद. तो ये हो गया ट्राइबल इंटीग्रेशन. नेक्स्ट टॉपिक दैट वील कवर इज लैंड रिफॉर्म्स. हमको कवर क्या क्या करना है इसमें? फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल दी issues faced by the farmers which made land reforms necessary post independence. What were the hurdles which made the process of land reform problematic? What were the efforts or laws undertaken to implement the problematic process of land reforms? And finally, critical analysis of the process of land reforms which took place post independence. How successful was it? What were the limitations and what has been its impact? ठीक है, तो ये सब चीजें हमको डिस्कस करनी. फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल दी इश्यूज. Now, at the time of independence, roughly two-thirds or more than two-thirds of all Indian farmers were landless tenants. ठीक है, उनके पास अपनी खुद की कोई जमीन नहीं. fact, this figure was about 71%. So 71% farmers suffered from landlessness. Hamza Alvi presented a study in the 1960s in which farmers have been categorized into 4 categories. Rich farmers, middle farmers, poor farmers, and landless peasants. Okay? Rich farmers are those which have more than 10 acres of land. They are not directly involved in the process of cultivation and they depend upon hired labor to cultivate their lands for. Middle farmers having 5 to 10 acres of land and they also utilized hired labor, wage labor, but only in the busy parts of the cropping season, that is during harvesting and sowing season, sowing and harvesting season. Poor farmers are those which have less than 5 acres of land, between 2 to 5 acres of land. And ये ऐसे farmers होते हैं which rely only upon their own labor, their family labor, and during the busy season they also work as wage labor for the rich and middle farmers. And landless peasants कौन है? They have no land and work either as bonded labor or as wage labor on the farms of rich farmers or the middle farmers. तो एक बड़ा प्रॉब्लम था लैंडलेसनेस, उसको ओवरकम. सेकेंड बिग प्रॉब्लम वाज क्रेडिट अवेलेबिलिटी. राइट, इंडिया में फार्मिंग से रिलेटेड दूसरा सबसे बड़ा प्रॉब्लम था द प्रॉब्लम ऑफ मनी लेंडिंग, which was a major cause for 1951 survey by the RBI found that only 4% of Indian farmers had access to institutional credit, while the others depended upon informal credit. They fell into the clutches of money lenders. तीसरा प्रॉब्लम था लेवल ऑफ टेक्नोलॉजिकल एक्सेस. In 1954, a survey found that only 3% of Indian farmers were using the iron plow. बाकी सब wooden plow use कर रहे थे. There was very little penetration of artificial irrigation or of high yield variety seeds or of modern pesticides and fertilizers. As a result, हुआ क्या? That while the population of India following independence continued to increase at an annual rate of 3% per annum, the rate of agricultural growth was only 0.5% per annum. Therefore, there was a mismatch between the rising population and the rising agricultural output. इसका result क्या हुआ? There was a shortage of food. Food scarcity was a direct result of it. And in order to overcome these issues, land reforms had to be. So write down issues. लिखो. सबसे पहला landlessness. Write down. More than two-thirds, brackets, approximately 71% of Indian farmers, 71% of Indian farmers were landless. So stop. They did not own any land and lived as tenants or bonded labor on the land of others. Next point. Land of others. According to Hamza Alvi, Indian farmers could be categorized into A, B, C, and D. A. Rich farmers, more than 10 acres. B. Middle farmers with 5 to 10 acres. Of land. They depended upon 5 to 10 acres of land. They depended upon hired labor. During the sowing and harvest season. C. Poor farmers owning between 2 and 5 acres. Stop. They depended only on family labor and in the busy seasons they also worked on the fields of others. And D. Landless peasants or laborers. They worked on the lands of zamindars and rich peasants. Worked on the lands of zamindars and rich peasants and paid rent. Paid rent. Okay? So this was one issue, landlessness. All right. Next, number 2, credit facility. Credit facility. A 1954 RBI survey 1954 RBI survey concluded that only 7% of Indian farmers had access to institutional credit. Had access to institutional credit. Stop. The others were forced to borrow from exploitative money lenders. Were forced to borrow from exploitative money lenders. Next, number 3. Technological access. Most Indian farmers used primitive methods of farming. Used primitive methods of farming. In 1951, only 3% Indian farmers were using iron plows. The point. The availability of artificial irrigation was low. The availability of artificial irrigation was low. In brackets, you can write 13%. And agriculture was primarily rain fed. Next point. Access to synthetic fertilizers, modern pesticides, and high yield variety seeds, HYV seeds. Synthetic fertilizers, modern pesticides, and HYV seeds was virtually non-existent. Next the point. Virtually non-existent. Farmers also lack sufficient supply of cheap electricity. Cheap electricity. Thus, farming could not be mechanized. Could not be mechanized. इलेक्ट्रिसिटी की जगह पे यू शुड यूज द वर्ड पावर. ना बिजली था ना फ्यूल. Agriculture could not be mechanized. Next sub point लिखो. As a result, the rate of agricultural growth was stagnant at roughly the rate of agricultural growth was stagnant at roughly 0 to 0.5%. 0 to 0.5%. While population was growing at 3% per annum. 3% per annum. Leading to a severe food shortage. Leading to a severe food shortage. ये हो गए the issues. Give me a since most leaders came from land-owning classes themselves. Land-owning classes themselves. So stop. Next point. Additionally, the government functionaries at almost all levels, upper, middle and lower, were involved at least in some capacity, with landlordism. Example, the low level functionaries such as patwaris were themselves the rent collecting agents of big zamindars. The rent collecting agents of big zamindars. The point. Sorry, next main point. Another major hurdle was the inavailability of proper land records. Of proper land records. In some cases, land records had not been updated. Land records had not been updated for more than a century. Updated for more than a century. मुगलों के जमाने के लैंड रिकॉर्ड्स अभी तक चल रहे थे कई जगहों पर फॉर मोर देन अ सेंचुरी. Next, the country lacked necessary infrastructure. The country lacked necessary infrastructure to carry out land consolidation and agricultural modernization. Land consolidation and agricultural modernization. So, next point. The paucity of funds and expertise also slowed down the process of agricultural modernization and economic क्या लिखा है? The paucity of funds and expertise also slowed down the process of agricultural modernization and extension of formal credit. So, next, finally, the legal profession staunchly opposed the regulation of money lending. Why? Because the money lending business was a major source of income for the lawyers. Why? क्योंकि मनी लेंडिंग की वजह से कई सारे लीगल और इकोनॉमिक डिस्प्यूट्स इमर्ज होंगे एंड लॉयर्स को पैसा वहीं से. Since money lending or since the money lending business provided opened a major field of litigation, contributed a major portion litigation and constituted a major source of income for lawyers. एक और hurdle that was constitutional in nature. क्या? Right to property had been made a fundamental right. Therefore, the right to land reform को अगर implement करना है, so property would have to be taken from some and given to others. So that right would have been violated. Right down. Lastly, The constitution makers had made the right to property a fundamental right, which would have made land distribution legally impossible. Legally possible. ठीक है, ये हो गए the different hurdles in the path of land reforms. Next, efforts or laws. Now, land सेंट्रल सब्जेक्ट है या स्टेट सब्जेक्ट है? स्टेट सब्जेक्ट है. Thus, the states had to take the lead with regards to land reforms. शुरुआत होती है in 1949 with the UP State Legislative Assembly drafting its Land Redistribution Act 1949. Now, this would become the Model Act for other states. However, progress remained slow, especially in the first decade after independence. लेकिन इसकी वजह से हुआ क्या? Left wing extremism, form of Maoism, began to rise, especially in eastern and southern India. Therefore, a greater sense of urgency regarding land reforms was felt. 1959 कांग्रेस का एनुअल सेशन हुआ एट नागपुर. इंडिपेंडेंस के बाद भी कांग्रेस अपने सेशंस करती रही. नागपुर सेशन में a resolution was passed to accelerate the process of land reforms, and by the end of 1961 almost all states had passed their own Land Reforms Act or Land Sealing Acts, fixing the maximum amount of land that could be owned by one single family to an upper limit ranging from 3 acres to 27 acres of land. Okay, depending upon the availability of land and the demand of land. So, almost all states had passed their own Land Sealing Acts. Now, in 1961, roughly 31% of all Indian farmers owned their own land. ठीक है, तो 29 से ये परसेंटेज बढ़ करके 31 हुआ था. However, progress has been still quite low. By 1971, जब अगला सेंसस हुआ, this proportion had increased to 91.1%. देखने में क्या लग रहा है? लैंड रिफॉर्म सक्सेसफुल हुए हैं? बिल्कुल हुए हैं. Virtually all the farmers are now landowners. There are very few landless laborers. Bihar topped the list with 99.6% of farmers being landowners. Okay. However, upon closer observation, the reality emerged. Yeah, that in North Indian states, the process of land reforms had been abortive, and several problems had emerged, such as Benami transactions, such as fictitious transfers of land, etc. Right? तो ये केवल बोलने के लिए 99.6% था, actually इतना. In some states such as West Bengal, Kerala, and Kashmir, the process of land reforms was much more सक्सेसफुल. लेकिन प्रॉब्लम क्या हुआ यहाँ पर, दैट यहाँ पे जो गवर्नमेंट्स थी देवर क्वाइट लेफ्ट विंग. वेस्ट बंगाल और केरला में तो कम्युनिस्ट गवर्नमेंट से थी, और कश्मीर में जो शेख अब्दुल्ला की गवर्नमेंट थी दैट टुक अवे लैंड फ्रॉम द बिग लैंड ओनर्स, most of whom were pandits, and distributed it among the peasants, most of whom were Muslims, without giving any compensation to the Kashmiri pandits. So communalism and communism की वजह से there was great degree of bloodshed also. एक बार जब खून बहना शुरू होता है तब रुकता नहीं. क्यों? क्योंकि यहाँ पे revolutionary ideology had succeeded, therefore North Indian states में भी same revolutionary ideology implement करी जाएगी for doing land reforms. Apart from these legal and revolutionary routes, Gandhian methods were also undertaken in order to conduct land reforms. Acharya Vinoba Bhave ने कौन सा मूवमेंट शुरू किया? भूदान मूवमेंट. कहां पर? In erstwhile Andhra Pradesh, from a place called Pochampalli. Right? Objective क्या था इसका? To convince the big landlords to donate 1/3 of their land, which could be donated among the poor peasants, landless peasants. टारगेट कितना था? 50 लाख एकर्स. रियलाइज कितना हुआ? 8.73 lakh. Success or failure? Failure. Further, the bulk of the land that was donated that fell in the category of uncultivable wasteland. तो ये बंजर जमीन थी जहां पे कल्टीवेशन पॉसिबल नहीं था. राइट? तो लो क्वालिटी लैंड was donated. A parallel movement also emerged in Odisha known as the Ramdan movement. Based on the philosophy that the common land of the village does not belong to any single person, rather it belongs to God or Gopal and is for the use of the entire village community. Bengal, Orissa, if you remember, used to be part of Bengal. It was a zamindari area. और यहाँ पर पूरा का पूरा जो विलेज लैंड था, इंक्लूडिंग फॉरेस्ट, रोड्स, वेल्स, पूल्स एंड लेक्स, टैंक्स एटसेट्रा, ये सब कुछ जमींदार की ओनरशिप के अंदर दे दिया गया था. बिग लैंडेड estates had come into existence. Now zamindars of Odisha were asked to give away these common lands to the villages for their own use. Did they respond? No. This also ended in failure. Apart from a few talukas where portions of village land were granted to the village community were given up, बाकी जगहों पर जमींदार did not budge. Right? So the Gandhian method of class cooperation and trusteeship had failed, and Marxists ने इनको कैसे इंटरप्रेट किया? That these are conspiratorial activities क्या कॉन्स्पिरेसी है? That Gandhians have always been interested in protecting the interests of the landlords over the peasants. Peasants have started becoming radicalized. That is why the Gandhians, such as Acharya Vinoba Bhave, have started a movement based on the idea of trusteeship in order to diffuse the radical peasant, right? तो क्लास कॉन्फ्लिक्ट को डिफ्यूज करने के लिए ये कर रहे हैं. So it was, according to them, it was a deliberate attempt to slow down the radical peasant upsurge. Okay? So this is the way in which land reforms were implemented. Fully successful? No. Fully failure? Also no. ठीक है? Successful तो हुए, जो ultimate objectives थे, they were reached, but not without bloodshed and conflict. So write down efforts or laws. देखो, since land is a state subject, comma, states had to take the lead. States had to take the lead. Full stop. Next point. In 1949, the UP State Assembly passed the UP Land Reform Act, also known as the Zamindari Abolition Act. Passed the Zamindari Abolition Act, which became the basis, or sorry, the model law for other states. Next point. The first Constitution Amendment Act, 1951, removed the right to property as a fundamental right. And added the ninth schedule. Ninth schedule क्या है? It is a list of those laws which are not subject to judicial review. ठीक है? Write down. Which protects social legislations from judicial review. Next point. However, beyond this, the process of land reform remains slow due to a combination of hurdles. क्या hurdles? जो हम already mention कर चुके हैं. Lack of land records, lack of political will, lack of cooperation by the officials, these kinds of things. Okay? Next main point. This resulted in the emergence of left-wing extremism especially in southern and eastern India. Southern and eastern India. Prompting the Congress to resolve to accelerate the process of land reforms at its Nagpur session at its Nagpur session 1959. 1950. Stop. Next point. By 1961, almost all states had passed their own land reform acts or land reform laws, including zamindari abolition, tenancy reform, and placing a land ceiling ranging from 3 to 27 acres. A land ceiling, a land placing a land ceiling ranging from 3 to 27 acres. Stop. Next point. Between 1961 to 1971, the proportion of landowning farmers had increased from 31 to 91%. With Bihar topping the list at 99.6%. At 99.6%. Next point. However, this success was misleading. This success was misleading. Stop. क्यों कह रहे हैं misleading? देखो, point. Sub point. In reality, the North Indian states had performed extremely poorly. Stop. Grave problems such as benami transactions, evictions of tenants, comma, small land holdings and low productivity derailed derailed the process of land reforms. Derailed the process of land. Sub, Subpoint. Caste played a very important role. A very important role in the abortive process of land reforms. Next main point. On the other hand, some states such as West Bengal, Kerala, and Kashmir were effective were effective in land distribution land distribution, but land reforms were accompanied by were accompanied by ideological and communal violence. Ideological and communal violence. Next main point. Communal violence. अगला मेन पॉइंट लिखो. Gandhian efforts were also made to carry out land reforms. Acharya Vinoba Bhave launched the Bhudan movement in the Telangana region in 1951. A parallel Gramdan movement was launched in Odisha. These movements called upon zamindars to voluntarily donate a portion of their lands to be distributed among peasants. However, the response portion of their lands to be distributed among landless peasants. However, the response was lackluster in both cases. was lackluster in both cases. So, subpoint, Marxists accused the Gandhians of trying to sabotage the radical leftist movement that was emerging among peasants, as seen by the violence in Kerala and West Bengal. ठीक है, नेक्स्ट मेन पॉइंट लिखो, सॉरी नेक्स्ट पोर्शन क्या है, क्रिटिकल एनालिसिस. While the land reform programs succeeded in abolition of zamindari, the regulation, or let us say the extension of farm credit and the regulation of tenancy the success was mixed. In North India, land reforms were not taken sincerely. Added to this was the emerging caste tensions in North India. And in other states, West Bengal, Kerala, and Kashmir, the process of land reforms had been a bloody one, but a successful one. Therefore, this revolutionary ideology also became prominent in North India, and caste-based riots started to take place. Worst affected were Bihar and Eastern UP. Okay? So, success remained mixed. And due to the abortive nature of land reforms, क्या देखने के लिए मिलता है हमें? The rise of left-wing extremism and violence. The two most prominent examples of these, Naxalite movement, which emerged in eastern and central India from 1967 onwards, and the bandits of and what are the lessons learnt? That land reforms require a number of inputs, such as presence of good quality of relevant land records, political will, as well as technological expertise, not only to redistribute land, but to make agriculture profitable for all involved. That is going to create the will for further land, right? it also requires some other solutions such as land consolidation and mechanization of agriculture, जिसके लिए funds का भी input चाहिए, right? And there is no one stop solution. The process of land reforms began immediately after independence, but is yet to be completely concluded. It's an ongoing process. Write down. While land reforms, critical analysis, successfully abolished zamindari, protected tenants, and made farm credit available. Protected tenants and made farm credit available to peasants, comma, in North India. Much of this progress remained on paper. On paper. So, the added complication of caste divide in the agrarian structure resulted in caste-based riots and politics from the 1970s onwards. From the 1970s onwards. Riots and politics from the 1970s onwards. The worst affected areas were Eastern UP and Bihar. Next point. While West Bengal, Kerala, and Kashmir were more successful with respect to land reforms. With respect to land reforms, comma, bloodshed could not be avoided. Resulting in the growth of left-wing extremism in areas where land reforms were stalled. Were stalled. Also, next point. The two most significant manifestations of this were A and B. A, the Naxalite movement, and B, the bandits of Chambal. Bandits of Chambal. Okay? This was the critical analysis of the process of land reforms. Right? तो land reforms का topic भी हमने cover कर लिया है. Some small topics are remaining. Communalism, फॉरेन पॉलिसी, नेहरूवियन फॉरेन पॉलिसी पोस्ट इंडिपेंडेंस एंड इन्वायरमेंटल स्टाइल ऑफ इन्वायरमेंटल। ये हम मंडे की क्लास में कवर। एनी डाउट्स? नो? चलिए देन, थैंक यू फॉर योर टाइम, सी यू गाइस ऑन